So, I obviously ideally imagined this lecture as a public space performance where the philosophical ideas of Henri Lefebvre on time and space, his very words, would transform into a public space performance during which I would engage into dialogue with the rhythms of the city. As things now stand, this performance has morphed into a lecture, which takes place in a different kind of public space, this room, where I will verbally describe the noise and comings and goings and fuss and energy of the center of a city. These elements are the core of Henri Lefebvre's philosophical work. They also outline a subject which I hope to develop into a both artistic and academic project. So the thoughts expressed in the frame of this paper will hopefully become the nucleus of this future project. So as a trained musician, I'm groomed to the notion of time as an intrinsic part of artistic process, to the notion of beat, tempo, and rhythm as absolute prerequisites for a structured and fine-tuned artistic output. My experience as a street artist greatly expanded my spectrum, not only in that it familiarized me with the notion and experience of space, but in that it revealed to me a completely different dimension of time and rhythm as lived experiences. Performing in the center of a city exposes one to noise, loads of noise, to constant movement, to shifting energies, to multiple trajectories overlapping and crossing. In a word, it is the experience of the myriad rhythms developing and manifesting, invading and investing the space around. To put it differently, as a street performer, by my very presence at a given space, at a given time, I find myself in the middle of a sea of rhythms which permeate me as a physical entity and with which I engage in conversation through my art. So the image of the city as a place of infinite rhythms is central to the thought of French philosopher Henri Lefebvre. In his final work titled Éléments de Rhythmanalysis, in English Rhythmanalysis, he introduced the concept of rhythm as a vehicle for comprehending and analyzing space, time, and everyday life. Lefebvre envisages a rhythmanalyst, a specialist who would detect and analyze rhythms based on scientific disciplines such as philosophy, sociology, or psychology, but also on the arts, especially on music and also on painting or poetry. I will argue that a public space performer, regardless of his or her exact artistic discipline, becomes every time, either intentionally or inadvertently, a de facto rhythmanalyst. This latter not perceived as a passive observer, but as an active agent of awareness and as an instigator of action, interaction, and of change. In Rhythmanalysis, Lefebvre explicitly links time and space in light of his extended work on the production of space, production de l'espace, and the right to the city, le droit à la ville. Everywhere where there is interaction between a place, a time, and an expenditure of energy, there is rhythm, says Lefebvre. Concrete times have rhythms, or rather are rhythms, and all rhythms imply the relation of a time to a space, a localized time, or if one prefers, a temporalized space. Rhythm is always linked to such and such a place, to its place, be that the heart, the fluttering of the eyelids, the movement of a street, or the tempo of a waltz. Inversely, space is the manifestation of the use of time within a given society. Therefore, Lefebvre claims, analyzing rhythms can change our perspective on our surroundings. In nature, as in society, rhythms rarely stand alone. Polyrhythmia means that many rhythms coexist within the same entity. For example, the human body. The living body, Lefebvre notices, can and must consider itself as an interaction of organs situated inside it, where each organ has its own rhythm, but is subject to a spatio-temporal whole, globalité. For example, the pulse stands out, but many rhythms coexist in our body, which we cannot probably hear or experience firsthand. But the surroundings of bodies, as Lefebvre, be they in nature or a social setting, are also bundles, bouquets, garlands of rhythms, to which it is necessary to listen in order to grasp the natural or produced ensembles. To grasp rhythm and polyrhythmias in a sensible, preconceptual, but vivid way, Lefebvre proposes, it is enough to look carefully at the surface of the sea. Waves come in succession. They take shape in the vicinity of the beach, the cliff, the banks. These waves have a rhythm, which depends on the season, the water and the winds, but also on the sea that carries them, that brings them. Each sea has its rhythm. That of the Mediterranean is not that of the oceans. Human societies are also essentially polyrhythmic. Societies are composed of crowds, of groups, of bodies, of classes, and constitute peoples. They understand the rhythms of which living beings, social bodies, local groups are made up. In his Projet Rhytmanalytical, Rhythm Analytical project, for example, Henri Lefebvre examines Mediterranean cities as a noticeable case of polyrhythmic societies. Lefebvre frames the project with ideas previously developed in his critique of everyday life. He describes the rhythmic aspect of time as twofold, cyclical and linear. He describes the cyclical originates in nature, the linear is related to human activity. Everyday life is modeled on abstract, quantitative time, the time of watches and clocks. This homogeneous and desacralized time has emerged victorious, since it supplied the measure of the time of work. Since the time of work became the time of everydayness, says Lefebvre, other aspects of everyday life were subordinated to it. The hours of sleep and walking, meal times, and the hours of private life, the relations of adults with their children, entertainment and hobbies, the relations to the place of dwelling. At the same time, however, everyday life remains shot through and traversed by great cosmic and vital rhythms, day and night, the months, and the seasons. When exploring polyrhythmia in the context of human society, that is, in the context of human interactions and relations, Lefebvre recognizes two fundamental rhythms, the rhythm of the self and the rhythm of the other. The rhythm of the other is related to the social rhythms, the rhythms pertaining to public life, the rhythms of representation. Just a sec. Rhythms that are more restrained, more formalized, forming rituals which penetrate and permeate social and everyday life. The rhythms of the self, on the other hand, are linked to more deeply inscribed rites, organizing a time turned moreover towards private life, therefore opposing self-present to representation, as such, quieter, more intimate forms of consciousness to the forms of discourse. That being said, the rhythms of the self may be private or more private, but they are not necessarily identical to the natural rhythms of the body. In modern societies, ever since childhood, we have all been through a training process, dressage, in order to adapt or bend to an established social rhythmic model, one that Lefebvre qualifies as military model. These acquired rhythms, all of us have internalized, usually leave an impression of spontaneity, but they are often automatic or automated behaviors, resulting from external constraints to an essential need. For example, he who rises at 6 in the morning because he is rhythmed in this way by his work. Perhaps decades are needed, observes Lefebvre, to bend the body to these rhythms, and it is not uncommon for children to refuse social rhythms. Sometimes rhythms of the self and rhythms of the other, acquired rhythms and natural rhythms, coexist and interconnect harmoniously. But other times there are disruptions and crises. It is the same with rhythms of the everyday. Cosmic rhythms perpetually interact with repetitive processes linked to homogeneous time. In this sense, the everyday is simultaneously the site of, the theater for, conflict between great indestructible rhythms and the processes imposed by the socio-economic organization of production, consumption, circulation, and habitat. This contrast of rhythms, this interference into one another, makes them sensible, discernible. It is at that point of conflict that we become aware of or are reminded of their existence. A significant factor towards imbalance and conflict is that not all these rhythms are valued and appraised equally. The priority usually being given to social time or the rhythm of work or clocks, which is thought to be the essential time and the rhythm of reference. Natural rhythms of the body or the intellect, however, may not be compatible to it. This is a struggle between measured, imposed external time and a more endogenous time, embodying two opposing tendencies, the tendency towards homogenization and that towards diversity. Through a certain use of time, the citizen resists the state, says Lefebvre. A struggle for appropriation is therefore unleashed, in which rhythms play a major role. Through them, civil, therefore social time, seeks to and succeeds in withdrawing itself from linear, unirhythmic, measure state time. Thus, public space, the space of representation, becomes spontaneously a place for walks and encounters, intrigues, diplomacy, deals, and negotiations. It theatralizes itself. Thus, the time and the rhythms of the people who occupy the space are linked back to the space. Indeed, the interaction and conflict of rhythms becomes way more tangible when it comes to the use of space. As mentioned above, Lefebvre understands space as the manifestation of the use of time within a given society. The relation of the townsman to his town, to his neighborhood, says Lefebvre, does not only consist in the sociological relation of the individual to the group. It is, on the one hand, a relation of the human being with his own body, with his tongue and his speech, with his gestures within a certain place, and on the other hand, a relation with the largest public space, with the entire society, and beyond this, with the universe. Urban, which is to say public space, becomes the site of a vast staging, where all these relations with their rhythms show and unfurl themselves. Rights, codes, and relations make themselves visible here. They act themselves out. All in all, within the confines of a city, private and public, natural and social, are in perpetual interaction and offer friction. This is immediately and clearly felt when performing in the street, not as some abstract theory, but as tangible reality. For Lefebvre's public space of representation, the theater of conflict, is of course the natural environment of a public space performer, and his or her field of operations, pun intended. The quality of the video is not very good. I'm very thankful to the friend who took the video. It was not an easy task. So this is a video from a performance I did back in 2015, and was related to the then imminent referendum on the European help, and so it was kind of a comment on that situation. So, whether intentionally or not, by his or her very presence at a given place, the public space performer finds himself or herself interjected into a vibrant, intricate, and multidimensional tissue of social, personal, natural, or acquired rhythms, which are simultaneously and often in contrast to one another embodied within the same space. Whether intentionally or not, by the very nature of his or her art, that is, performance in the public space, the artist intervenes into this tissue of localized times or temporalized spaces, sometimes to a significant degree, others less so, but alters them every time. Lefebvre imagines a rhythmanalyst, a specialist whose mission would be to listen to the rhythms of the world. Lefebvre never refers to street performance, even remotely, even though he makes numerous references to other arts, such as music, poetry, painting, and sometimes theater. His description of the ideal rhythmanalyst, however, is literally a description of the creative process of a public space performer slash researcher as I have experienced it. For obvious reasons, in the extras that will follow, I have changed the gender from masculine to feminine, but the description is otherwise intact. It's Lefebvre's words. She listens at first to her body. She learns rhythm from it, in order to consequently to appreciate external rhythms. Her body serves her as a metronome. The Rhytmanalyst, just like the street performer, calls on her senses, of her blood, the beatings of her heart, and the delivery of her speech as landmarks. She thinks with her body, not in the abstract, but in lived temporality. She guards herself in this tissue of the lived, of the everyday. She exists between rhythms, a dialectical relation, neither exclusion nor inclusion. Yeah. I chose to show you the full video. So in a way, everything becomes part of the performance. Okay. Yeah. After the official end of the performance, it's even funnier. I watched it yesterday. I never watch my videos because, and I watched it yesterday for this presentation. And I was like, okay, I will show the full thing. So let's go back to Lefebvre while we're watching the city unfurl, the rhythms of the city. So she guards herself in this tissue of the lived, of the everyday. She exists between rhythms. A dialectical relation, I must say, neither exclusion nor inclusion. The act of rhythmanalysis, just like the act of street performance, transforms everything into presences, including the present, grasped and perceived as such. She is an empirist. She changes that which she observes. She sets in motion, she recognizes its power. Such an artist, says Lefebvre, might return to intervene in the everyday, without claiming to change life, but by fully reinstating the sensible in consciousnesses and in thoughts, she would accomplish a tiny part of the revolutionary transformation of this world and this society in decline, without any declared political position. Liberty is born in a reserved space and time, sometimes wide, sometimes narrow, occasionally reduced by the results of dressage to an unoccupied lacuna. Creative activity, as distinct from productive activity, proceeds from the liberty and individuality that unfurl only in conditions that are external to them. Most importantly, the public space performer has the power to reinstate what Lefebvre calls the appropriated time. This time is a time that forgets time, during which time no longer counts and is no longer counted. It arrives or emerges when an activity brings plenitude. This activity is in harmony with itself and with the world. It is in time, and it is a time, but does not reflect on it. By bringing this time into the everydayness of his or her co-citizens, the street artist executes a revolution, a disruption of rhythmical patterns, thus a reconsideration of political time. By interacting and intervening into the everyday That's why I decided to watch the full video. So, by interacting and intervening into the everyday rhythm, the public space performer penetrates into the core of society and societal norms, touches the deeply personal, natural rhythm, and the deeply political, externally imposed social rhythm, becomes a catalyst for a mutual recognition of these two, for a dialogue between them, but most importantly, helps the citizens realize its duality, usually lived but not consciously, and therefore to contemplate the possibility of reassessing priorities, maybe. Public space performance is therefore by its nature deeply political, regardless of the actual subject content of the performance itself, in that it generates a revaluation of the bonds between the citizens and the city, between the citizen and the state, aiming at the very core of citizenship, the everyday time and space. To go a step further, a street performer is always exposed to and integrated into the rhythms of the city, the rhythms of the everyday life, which takes over again. When conscientiously doing so, public space performance in addition to an artistic creation per se, it becomes a tool to not only comprehend social structures, human interactions, and human psychology in a unique way from a fresh and direct angle, but also to intervene, to provoke a reaction. Street performance is uniquely placed to merge theory and action, analysis, interaction, contemplation, and dialogue. Above all, communication and change. Thank you.